We're going to take a look here at my settings on the A6700 for cinematic video. Now, as we get started into this, keep in mind that the settings themselves don't make your videos cinematic. There's lots of things that go into it, like lighting, framing, and much more. But getting these settings right is your first step to getting that cinematic look. So as we first get into this is all touch screen, but I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to use the buttons here so we don't get fingerprints all over the screen for you. So starting off at this top star, you have what's called the My Menu settings. And I used to use this a lot on my older Sony cameras because, as you can see, there are a lot of menu options as we go through here, but Sony's really improved how the layout is with all these color codings for them, as well as this right here, which I really like. You can get to all your major settings pretty quickly. So I really don't use this much at all anymore because I can program most of everything I need to the custom buttons on the camera, as well as using this to quickly change the settings I need. So looking at these settings right off the bat, we have here your frame rate switching between 24, usually 60 and 120 are the only three I use for getting either 24 frames per second for a normal cinematic look or using 60 and 120 for that slow motion. Shutter speed, I'm always going double my frame rate, ISO, and aperture, and I have my camera set to manual. I always shoot in manual. I don't want the camera making any decisions for me. So then we have white balance here. I typically use Kelvin. I have videos on that as well if you don't understand how that works. Picture profiles here, and then we have the file format. So I'm typically shooting an XAVC-S 4K. That is a high quality 4K. If you want the highest, that's right here, but that's going to take up a lot more memory, and you need to have a V90 SD card in order to do that. Then once you pick your file format, you also have the record setting. I'm typically always shooting in the highest, 100 megabits per second, 422 10-bit. You also have the option of 420 8-bit, which if your computer doesn't recognize these files or can't process them, then this might be helpful for that. And if you want smaller file sizes, you have a smaller bit rate as well, but I like to go with the highest that we have. Then gamma display assist, that's basically putting a LUT over top of your picture profile, and then you can choose which one of these you want, or you can upload your own. Audio record level here, I typically use these Sony microphones that work really well, and they have an auto setting which works great in most situations. Then we have wind noise reduction, proxy recording, log shooting settings, formatting your memory card, file settings if you want to change the name for it. We've got focus area, focus mode, steady shot, shoot mode, subject recognition, autofocus, and recognition target. So you pretty much have everything you need when you're shooting right there if it's not something that's programmed to a button. So as we go through the rest of these settings now, I'm going to go through pretty quickly. You can always set the video to a slower speed if you want, but there is a lot to cover, and I'm only going to expand on things that might not totally make sense. So file format, we've already covered these, how you can get to that quickly in the first menu option, as well as these movie settings, your frame rates, and your bit rates. S&Q I don't use. I like to do my own frame rates. If I'm going to shoot slow motion, then I'm going to use that 60 or 120 and then slow it down in my 24 frames per second timeline when I'm editing. When it comes to time lapse, you can do the same thing here with setting up your time lapse, but I also actually prefer using the interval shooting function for my time lapses. Log shooting, so if you want to shoot and log, you can do that here, and you have the option of Cine S-Log3 or just S-Log3. And I actually don't really use this. I prefer using picture profiles, so you really just have to experiment and see what you like better and what's better for grading for you, because with the picture profiles, you can really fine-tune even more how you want that to work. For proxy settings, I have this off because my computer is pretty powerful and I don't really need it, but if you have a computer that has a hard time processing these files, you can record a proxy file. As you can see, this is just HD, so that's 720 like we see there, and then it's shooting at 6 megabits per second compared to that 100 megabits per second that we saw in the 4K earlier, or those higher ones have 240 megabits per second. So it records a second file like this. You can edit those proxy files in your computer, and then when you're done, you can apply all those edits to your main file, and it'll take a long time to render, but you won't have all the choppiness and issues trying to edit the highest quality footage the whole time. Lens compensation is a feature I really like, especially with these Sony G Master lenses. Breathing compensation is really good because that essentially punches in a tiny bit on your image, so when you're doing rack focusing, you don't have any changes in focal length, because these photography lenses will slightly change the focal length, which doesn't matter for photography because in that case you're taking pictures, but for video it's distracting if you're trying to do a rack focus, and this makes it look more like what you would see in a cinema lens. But unfortunately, again, it only works with most Sony lenses. Format, that's just for formatting your card. You do that and it deletes everything from your card and sets it up to record properly, so you definitely want to format the card before you start recording, especially if you're using a card from a different brand of camera camera, but make sure you have everything you need off the card first. Recover image database. I've had to do this once and it freaked me out when the pop-up showed that there were possible corrupted files, and it did that and everything worked fine, but not something fun to see. Display media info, there you go, shows that. Write serial number, I have off. File settings, you can go in and choose how you want your files to look. I don't really care, I just let it file like that sequentially. So we got our shoot modes here, camera set memory. This is something I really like because like right now this shows every setting and you can go through all these menus and see what all the settings are in the camera. But what's nice is you can go through ahead of time. If you're shooting some planned event that's live, you could go in and have number 1 say is your 24 frames per second, and number 2 is your 60, number 3 is your 120. You can easily switch back and forth between all those. There's a 1, 2, and 3 on top of the dial here, and all your settings will be saved. You can have white balance set ahead of time, your shutter speeds, apertures, everything. So if you know how you're gonna want to shoot certain scenes, you can quickly switch back and forth between those. So let's say we set that one right now, it's registered, and then if I went to 1 up here, that's all going to be set. It's the same as our current settings, but you can go up here, recall settings, and right there I can click number 1. When you're in these 1, 2, 3 settings, then it allows you to recall those, and you can set even more from these as well. So very useful there. Switching back to manual mode. Now we have silent mode settings. I have set to off. Release without lens is enable. Anti-flicker set. I don't mess with those. I just leave them off. But if you are shooting somewhere and you see lights flickering, you can just adjust your shutter speed by 1 or 2 clicks left or right, and it should fix the problem, and you won't really notice a big change in motion blur. Audio record level is on. I have it set to 22 right now, but when I'm using one of these, I just have it set to auto on the lens, and then this is grayed out because it's doing it itself. Depending on the type of microphone you're using, you'll want to change that based on the settings on your microphone and the setting that you're in. Audio out timing is live. I like to have wind noise reduction off. That's just personal preference. I don't mess with those. Time code run, have record run. There's also free run, just depending on how you like the time code to look. Time code make preset. I don't change any of that. Steady shot I have right now to active. I was doing a lot of handheld shooting earlier, but with standard there's no crop on the lens, whereas with active it crops in a little bit to give you even more stabilization. Steady shot adjust is set to auto, but if you were using a lens that wasn't recognized by the camera, you could go into manual and then select whichever focal length you are currently shooting. Now for zoom, I have zoom range set to clear image zoom, which lets you punch in 50% on your image with no real noticeable loss in image quality. Digital zoom I like to keep off because you will start getting quality falling apart a lot quicker with that. And then when you go into the zoom here, you can see that we're zooming in 50% and back out. So that's a useful feature of these cameras. And then we have custom zoom speeds for remotes if you're using any of that. Grid line I have on. I always like to use the rule of thirds grid. It's quite useful for framing, and I have videos on that as well. If you don't know what that is, emphasize record display is on. So essentially when you hit record, you get this red box around, kind of hard to tell with the red background, but it's just a little bit more helpful to make sure that you are recording rather than just having the tiny little REC right there. Then marker display, I currently have off, but when you turn it on, I have it set to this aspect ratio of 235:1, which is essentially your 21:9, more cinematic looking aspect ratio. You can set it to all kinds of other things like 4:3. I have videos on that, 2:1, but for now, that's what it's set on. So if we were to turn that on, now you see these white lines going across there, so you can frame according to that, keeping the image that you want in your video in that area, and then when you get to editing, you set up your timeline in that aspect ratio, and then stuff looks good because you framed based on that. But it is off for now. There's also center markers, lots of safety zone and guide frame options for you there. Self timer I have set to off. Auto slow shutter is off. Basically what this does is if you were set to any kind of auto mode, it wouldn't automatically slow your shutter speed, because in video we want to keep the shutter speed at that double your frame rate in most situations to get a natural looking motion blur, and this will keep it from doing that. But again, I don't shoot in auto, I'm shooting in manual. ISO, right now it's set to 100. You can set a range limit, so if you are shooting in auto ISO, then it won't let you go higher than a certain amount. Like say this camera doesn't do well past 3200, we'd set that. So then the camera would raise the ISO up to 3200 and then start taking the shutter speed down if it had to, or changing the aperture in order to get the proper exposure if you're using auto. I have exposure step set to 0.3. I don't do anything with the adjustments there. Metering mode, I typically use spot. Sometimes I'll use multi, but it's pretty rare. I usually do spot, and then what I want exposed properly, I'll put that center dot on that and then make sure it's exposed the way I want. Face priority and multi-metering I have off, because if I want to make sure someone's face or skin is properly exposed, then I'll use that spot metering like I showed earlier. And if you do have spot metering, then you have a couple options on how that one works. White balance, lots of options there. I'm typically set to Kelvin. Or if it's a planned shoot that I have more time, I could use a custom white balance and use a white balance card. Priority set and auto white balance is standard, which doesn't really matter to me because again, I don't use auto white balance. And then shockless white balance also goes with that auto. So if you're going from maybe say indoor to outdoor, or from one room to another that has a different type of lighting, then it'll change the white balance for you if you're in auto, and depending on how quickly you want to change it is what you'll use those settings for. Dynamic range optimizer I've set to off. Creative look is standard. There's lots of options in here that you can choose, like neutral or other things. Maybe you don't want to get into picture profiles yet, but you do want to get a more neutral look so that you can play around with some color grading as you learn it. That can be a useful tool there. Picture profiles are set to off, but you have all kinds of options here. As you can see, we're getting a more grayed out image on some of these, especially with picture profile 1. We see there that is S-Log3, and then you have a lot of options for all these other settings within it, and you can play around with those and with color grading and see what works for you as you learn more about that. And you can manage LUTs. You can import your own and use them. Say there's a certain look you like when you're using S-Log, you can make that LUT yourself on your computer, upload it to the camera, so then when you are shooting that picture profile, you can have the LUT overlaid and then see in camera what it's likely going to look like when you get to editing on your computer. Soft skin effect is off. I don't like any of these things like dynamic range or soft skin. I don't want them on because I don't want the camera doing any extra processing for me. I'll do that in editing. Zebra display I have off, but when I do use it, I typically put it on 100 plus, so things that are overexposed are what show up in the zebras. And now moving on to the focus modes. Right now I have it set to manual focus, but if I switch to auto, I typically use continuous autofocus, and then you have options here with transition speed, so how quickly it'll transition from one thing to a next, like if you're doing touch focus for a racking focus, then also subject shift sensitivity. So if you have multiple subjects in there, how quickly it's going to change from one of those subjects to the other. And those are things you just have to play around with depending on the speeds you like and the situation that you're filming. Autofocus assist I keep off. Focus area I typically set to wide. You can play around with different things, but wide seems to work pretty well for all the settings with using touch focus and touch tracking. Focus area limit, you can set which options you want in there. I just leave them all checked because I don't mess with it anyways. It's pretty much always set to wide. Focus area color is white, so it'll show little white boxes. You can change it to red if you like. White works for me in most situations. I have this set to does not circulate. Auto focus frame move amount is standard. You can have large. Subject recognition autofocus is set to on. I have human set here, but you can pick what you want. So maybe there's animals in the frame, there's cars, trains, airplanes, whatever. You can select what you want for your screen so that the autofocus chooses that thing over something else. Recognition target select. If you don't ever do airplanes or maybe birds or whatever, you can change that in this setting, but again, I leave them all checked. Right or left eye select auto. This could come into play like say you're filming someone at an angle and their right eye is closer. You don't want it bouncing back and forth between the left and right eye, so you could select right eye and then it'll stay focused on that eye, and you won't see shifts in your autofocus if you have a low aperture set. Subject recognition from display I've set to on. Face memory, so you can see here I was playing around with it using one of my kids for it. Essentially what this does is I can select her face, and if I have all my kids there together, it'll choose to focus on her rather than the focus box jumping around among faces trying to decide who it should focus on. And register face priority is on. You can set that to off and then you won't even have those options. Focus map I have set to off. Focus magnifier, this essentially just punches in, so like when I have the camera in manual focus, I can punch in and see better what is in focus at 4x. There's no limit, so if I do that, it'll stay punched in until I go back out of it. And then the initial focus magnification I have ×4 because you can do ×1, but then you basically have to hit that button twice, which I don't see any point in magnifying ×1 because you're not magnifying at all. And then we have peaking levels. Peaking display I have off, but when I use it, I typically use high and red, and I'll turn this on if I'm using manual focus to make sure what I want is in focus. Now these settings, I don't really mess with anything here except one thing. This is all personal preference depending on what you want. What I do right here is for delete settings. For delete confirm, I put delete first, so when I do go to delete something, it pops up delete, I hit delete. Otherwise, if you had cancel first, when you hit delete, it's gonna pop up cancel, then you gotta switch down to delete and click another button. And I just don't wanna have to hit extra buttons. So then all of these, again, I don't mess with. It's personal preference depending on what you want. Getting into the networking functions, I don't use any of this on my cameras. What I typically do is go in here and turn Wi-Fi off as well as Bluetooth off, and I turn airplane mode on, and that way I'm not wasting battery with it searching for Wi-Fi or Bluetooth signals. Now in this last section, language, that's pretty obvious. Your area, date, time setting, you figure all that out. NTSC, PAL, if you have your camera and it's set to 25 and 50 and 100 frames per second and you can't figure out why it is, whereas mine's in 24, 30, 60, and 120, those numbers that I just said for my camera are NTSC. The 25, 50, 100 is PAL. So if it's one or the other and you don't want it, you go to this, you hit enter, it's going to restart the camera, and then it'll show you those other frame rates. You can save your settings and then load them. And then customization. This is what I really like with these cameras. I don't do anything for the photography customization. I'm just going over the video. So starting out, number one, that's a little button on the side here. What used to be the record button on the A7S II, I have set to metering mode, focus magnifier right here. So that 4X we talked about before. And then peaking display I have set to the trash can. Next up, we have steady shot. I have set to this middle button here so I can quickly switch between active and standard stabilization, whether I'm using a tripod or handheld or whatever the situation is. Audio record level I've set to the left. Zoom I've set to the right, so I can click that button and then zoom in that clear image zoom up to 50% that I showed earlier. And then marker display I have set there so I can quickly toggle on and off that 2:35:1 aspect ratio marker. Then on to the next section, movie shooting. There's a red record button on top. I don't change that. I leave it on movie shooting. White balance is the C2 button right next to it. And then I don't set this lens button because not all my lenses have that button, so I don't want to get used to using it and then not have it available. And then you have your dial and wheel modes, which on this camera I really like that they've improved the grip. It's a lot larger. It has a contour for your finger and it has a wheel on the front. So I have that front wheel set to shutter speed, this back wheel set to aperture, and then this wheel here set to ISO. There is a button here that's standard where you click it and then change the ISO, but I don't like having to click stuff. I change these things pretty quickly when I'm shooting, so I like to just spin the dial for my ISO without having to click a button first. And then also we have function menu settings. So again, I don't mess with the picture ones. Down here I have autofocus transition speed. I have subject shift sensitivity on the autofocus, focus area, zebra level, picture profiles, the gamma display assist for those picture profiles, audio record level, peaking color, marker display, steady shot, and touch function in shooting. And then skipping down through these, have the shutter speed and aperture rotation set to normal, so going to the right makes it go up, going to the left makes it go down. Dial and wheel lock I have unlocked so I can change those even when I'm recording. Touch operation is set to on, I have touch panel only. And then touch panel settings for shooting screen, I have almost everything off except for touch function and shooting is touch focus, because these different things you have, you can swipe up left and right on the screen and then different menu options pop up. But when you do that, they're covering parts of your screen where you're trying to record. And I don't like stuff covering my image, so I don't want to have to swipe things around. I've got everything set that I really need customized, and also in the function menu I can get to really quick. So for me, that is a cool function to have, but I just turn it off and then have my touch function set so that I can touch and focus on things. Because if that's not set, then you won't be able to use touch focus on this camera. And within this touch function and shooting, you can go from touch focus to touch tracking. That's one of the settings that I put in my function menu because it is kind of hard to get to that in the menu. So here, if you go to touch tracking, whatever you touch, it's going to track that around the screen. Like maybe someone's walking toward you and there's a lot of people. You want to follow a certain person, you can touch that person and it'll track them as they come to you rather than just focusing on the spot where they are initially and then them going out of focus as they come near you. But 90% of the time I'm using touch focus. And then also touch function is set to on for both the playback and the menu screen. So when we're in here, you can touch these things if you don't want to use the pad here. Then touch pad settings I have set to on, absolute position, and then whole screen. So the whole thing is working. Now we have selector, finder, and monitor is set to auto, so it'll automatically switch to the finder when you put your eye or anything else up over this, which can be annoying if you're shooting like this and your hand gets in the way. But when the screen is set out like this, which is how I'm typically shooting, that's not going to happen. It's only when your screen is in like this. Then monitor brightness I set to manual and have it full bright because I want to see all the colors and exposure as well as I can. Viewfinder brightness I have set to auto. I rarely even use the viewfinder. Display quality I've set to high. If you're first shooting on this and it doesn't look that great on here, it's probably set to standard. You go to high, it's going to use more battery, but if you're trying to focus and make sure colors and exposure and everything's right, I want to have the best possible quality on my screen. Frame rate standard, monitor flip direction I've set to auto. I don't change anything with this setting. Gamma display assist is off right now. Covered that earlier. You can change these various settings depending on if you're using picture profiles. Remain shoot display I have not displayed. Auto review is off. Shoot mode select screen is to display. And a lot of these is going to be personal preference for what works for you. This stuff isn't really going to affect the operation of your camera with shooting movies. It's more so little features that you have to play around with to see what you like. Auto monitor off, I have does not turn off. Power save start time is 5 minutes so that it will go into a sleep mode and not use up as much battery if I walk away and forget to turn it off. This is set to both linked. Auto power off temp I have set to high. It comes standard, but what high does is if the camera starts getting warm because you're shooting for a long time, say in 4K, it's going to last longer at the high setting before it shuts itself off. Now that's not something you want to do all the time, because you do that enough, it's going to start probably messing up the camera. But if you're shooting something like a live event, a wedding or something, and you need to make sure you're getting footage, then that's definitely something you want to have. Otherwise, make sure you're turning the recording off. If you don't need certain things, don't just leave it running forever for no reason. And it'll let you know here, the temperature of the device may rise. To prioritize recording time, would you like to change this setting? Volume settings, all of these are going to depend on your personal preference and what you're using. Same with USB connections, same with HDMI connections if you're using an external monitor. And I don't mess with auto pixel mapping or pixel mapping. You have the version, display the serial number, privacy notice, all that. So going through, those are all the settings for the Sony a6700. If you have any questions about these, post them in the comments, let me know. I'll try to help you out. Again, it's not the settings themselves that are going to make your videos good, but getting things like frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, learning how to shoot in manual. You need to have all that stuff down because it's the basis of what you build on in order to start figuring out, now how do I need to frame stuff? How do I need to light stuff? How is that light going to work with figuring out the exposure on my camera and how depth of field works, motion blur, and there's a whole lot of stuff that goes into it, color balance. And I have videos explaining all these topics in depth to help you understand how to use your camera even better. And I also have a video on the best lens for Sony APS-C cameras with video examples for it, showing what you can expect from that lens with a camera like the a6700. But the more you use your camera, the easier it's going to get. So again, post questions if you have them. I'll help you out the best I can, and I will see y'all in the next one.